Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The morning Los Angeles woke to the news of Paris Buckingham's death. The city felt strangely muted, as if even the sun rising over the ocean hesitated, unsure whether it should shine on a world where something so senseless, so brutal, could happen to someone so full of light. At Forrester Creations, the halls that were usually buzzing with creative energy, whispered conversations, and the steady rhythm of heels against marble floors were eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the low hum of distant sewing machines and the occasional gasp as another employee checked their phone and saw the headline again, unable to believe it no matter how many times they read it. Paris Buckingham found dead. Investigation ongoing. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. Paris was family here. Not just an employee, not just a designer or a muse, but someone whose warmth had stitched itself into the fabric of this place. And yet, just when the grief felt heavy enough to suffocate the building, a far more devastating rumor began to snake its way through the corridors, whispered first in disbelief, then with growing horror. Thomas Forrester's name was being mentioned by the police. Rich Forrester stood in his office staring out at the skyline, his hands braced against the glass as if the city itself might collapse without his support. Replaying the voicemail from the LAPD again and again in his mind, each word hitting harder than the last. "We need to ask you some questions about your son." At first, Rich had laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that carried no humor at all, convinced it was some kind of mistake because Thomas had his flaws, God knew that, but a killer? No, absolutely not. And yet, the doubt crept in anyway, unwelcome and relentless, because Thomas's past wasn't clean, and Rich knew better than anyone how complicated, how dark his son's inner world could become when obsession took hold. Brooke Logan, standing quietly in the doorway, watched the color drain from Ridge's face as reality began to sink in, and when he finally turned to her, his voice broke in a way she had rarely heard before. "They're saying Thomas was the last person to see her alive," he whispered, as if speaking louder might make it true. Brooke felt her heart drop into her stomach, memories flooding back of Thomas's history. The lies, the manipulations, the dangerous spiral he'd fallen into before, and she hated herself for the tiny voice inside her that asked the question she didn't want to ask. What if it's true? Across town, Steffi Forrester sat frozen at her kitchen table, her phone clutched in her hand as Finn tried desperately to ground her, reminding her to breathe, reminding her that speculation wasn't proof, but Steffi could barely hear him over the pounding in her ears. Thomas was her brother, her protector, the one who had always sworn he would never hurt another woman again. And yet Paris, sweet, trusting Paris, was gone. When the knock came at the door of Thomas's loft, sharp and authoritative, there was no mistaking what it meant. Thomas opened the door to find two uniformed officers standing there, their expressions professional but grim, and in that moment something inside him shattered because he knew, before they said a word, that his life was about to change forever. He didn't resist when they placed him in handcuffs, didn't argue as they read him his rights, because he was still stuck on one impossible thought looping endlessly in his mind. Paris is dead. The ride to the station passed in a blur of flashing lights and muffled radio chatter, Thomas staring straight ahead as memories of Paris played like a cruel montage. Her laughter in the design office, the way she believed in second chances, the last argument they'd had, sharp words spoken in frustration that now echoed with unbearable weight. At the station, when Ridge and Brooke arrived, breathless and frantic, the sight of Thomas behind the glass nearly brought Ridge to his knees, his son looking smaller, younger, nothing like the confident designer he'd raised, and when Ridge slammed his hand against the partition and shouted, "Tell them you didn't do this," Thomas finally looked up, his eyes filled with a terror Ridge had never seen before. "Dad, I swear I would never hurt her," Thomas said, his voice cracking, but the hesitation that followed, that brief, devastating pause, was all the detectives needed to justify their suspicion. The evidence, they explained calmly, was circumstantial but troubling. Thomas and Paris had been seen arguing the night she died. His fingerprints were found on a glass in her apartment, and a neighbor reported hearing raised voices shortly before the estimated time of death. Each detail landed like a blow, and Brooke felt herself shaking as the reality of it all closed in. Torn between wanting to protect Thomas and the horrifying possibility that Paris's death wasn't an accident. When news of the arrest spread, reactions rippled outward like shockwaves. Hope Logan sat alone in her office, staring at nothing as memories of Thomas's past betrayal resurfaced, Liam pacing restlessly nearby, torn between sympathy for the Forresters and an instinctive fear that history was repeating itself. People don't just change overnight, Liam muttered, and Hope snapped at him, more sharply than she intended, because even she didn't know what to believe anymore. At the Buckingham home, Grace collapsed into Carter Walton's arms when she heard the news, her sobs raw and unrestrained, demanding answers that no one could give, her grief quickly morphing into fury as the idea of Thomas Forrester walking free became unthinkable to her. If he did this, she cried, he will pay. Back at the station, Ridge confronted the detective, his voice trembling with rage and desperation. My son is not a killer, he insisted, the words tasting bitter on his tongue, because even as he said them, the question screamed in his mind, what if I'm wrong? The formal announcement came hours later. Thomas Forrester was officially under arrest pending further investigation into the death of Paris Buckingham. Cameras flashed as he was escorted out in handcuffs, reporters shouting questions, the headline writing itself before anyone could stop it, and when Ridge watched the footage on a muted television screen, he finally broke, sinking into a chair as tears streamed down his face, his voice barely a whisper as he asked the question that haunted every parent's worst nightmare. Is my son a killer? The days that followed were a relentless blur of interrogations, court filings, and public scrutiny, Thomas sitting alone in a cold cell replaying every moment of that last night, desperate to remember something, anything, that could clear his name while outside, the Forrester family fractured under the weight of uncertainty, loyalties tested, old wounds ripped open, and the once unthinkable reality looming larger with every passing hour. Whether Thomas was guilty or innocent no longer felt like just a legal question. It was a reckoning, one that threatened to redefine who the Forresters were, what they stood for, and how far love could stretch before it finally broke. Because in a world built on passion, betrayal, and second chances, nothing was more dangerous than the truth when it finally came out. The night after Thomas's arrest stretched on endlessly. The kind of night where sleep felt like a betrayal because closing your eyes meant facing the questions you were too afraid to ask when you were awake. Ridge sat alone in the darkened living room of the Forrester mansion, the soft glow from the city outside casting long shadows across the walls, his phone lying untouched on the table in front of him. Every few minutes it buzzed with another message. Reporters requesting statements, board members asking what this meant for the company, old friends offering hollow words of support, but Ridge couldn't bring himself to respond. All he could see was Thomas's face behind that glass partition at the police station, the fear in his eyes so raw it had cut straight through Ridge's chest. Brooke hovered nearby, wrapped in a blanket, watching the man she loved unravel in a way she'd never quite seen before. She wanted to reach out, to say something comforting, but every time she opened her mouth, the same terrifying thought stopped her cold. Comfort meant certainty, and certainty was the one thing none of them had. Ridge, she finally said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. We're going to get through this. Ridge let out a bitter laugh without looking at her. That's what I always say, he replied. And look where we are. Across town, Steffi lay awake beside Finn, staring at the ceiling as if the answers might be written there. Finn had offered to call in favors, to consult colleagues, to review autopsy reports once they were available, but Steffi shook her head every time. This wasn't something science alone could fix. This was her brother's soul on trial, and she didn't know if she could survive the verdict either way. Memories flooded her mind. Thomas shielding her from bullies when they were kids, Thomas spiraling after Caroline's death, Thomas swearing he'd changed, that he'd never cross that line again. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But Paris's face kept intruding, her gentle smile now frozen forever in memory, and Steffi felt something inside her crack. At the police station, Thomas sat on the edge of a narrow bench in a holding cell, his head in his hands, trying to piece together the fragments of the last night he'd seen Paris alive. He remembered going to her apartment unannounced, his emotions already running high, the argument that had exploded between them over misunderstandings and unresolved feelings neither of them wanted to admit out loud. He remembered raising his voice, seeing the hurt flash across Paris's face, hating himself even then for letting his temper take control. What he couldn't remember, what terrified him most, was how he'd left things. Did he storm out? Did she slam the door? Had there been a moment he'd lost control entirely? The gaps in his memory felt like open wounds, and the more he tried to fill them, the more they bled. When the detective returned to question him again, Thomas answered everything as honestly as he could, his voice hoarse as he repeated the same truth over and over. "I didn't kill her," he said, desperation seeping into every syllable. "We argued, yes. I was angry, yes. But I would never hurt Paris." The detective's expression didn't change. "Anger does things to people," he replied calmly. "Sometimes things they don't remember." That single sentence echoed in Thomas's mind long after the interrogation ended, wrapping around his fear and tightening like a noose. The next morning, the autopsy report sent shockwaves through everyone connected to the case. Paris had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a fall, but there were signs of a struggle, overturned furniture, defensive wounds on her arms. The medical examiner couldn't rule out foul play, and that ambiguity was enough to keep Thomas behind bars. When Ridge heard the details, he felt physically ill, gripping the kitchen counter as Brooke read aloud from a news article she wished she could unread. "A struggle," Ridge repeated, shaking his head. "That doesn't mean he did it." But the words sounded weaker each time he said them. At Forrester Creations, the impact was immediate and brutal. Buyers pulled out of meetings, investors demanded reassurances, and the board convened an emergency session to discuss Thomas's role in the company. Carter Walton sat at the head of the table, his usual calm demeanor strained as he laid out the legal realities. "Until this is resolved," Carter said carefully, "Thomas cannot remain in his position." The decision passed quickly, too quickly for Hope's comfort. As she watched Thomas's name be stripped from design boards and marketing plans, she felt a complicated mix of grief and anger. Part of her wanted to scream that this wasn't fair, that Thomas deserved the presumption of innocence. Another part whispered that maybe this was inevitable, that the shadows of his past had finally caught up with him. When Hope visited Thomas in jail later that day, the sight of him behind bars stole her breath. He looked exhausted, unshaven, his confidence replaced by something fragile and broken. "Hope," he said, standing when he saw her, his eyes filling with relief. "Thank you for coming." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Tell me the truth," she said quietly. "All of it." Thomas didn't hesitate. "I swear on my life I didn't kill Paris," he replied, tears spilling over. "I loved her. I would never." His voice cracked, and Hope felt her own resolve falter. She wanted to believe him, but belief felt dangerous now, like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Meanwhile, Grace Buckingham's grief hardened into a singular, unyielding purpose. She attended every press conference, every hearing, her face a mask of sorrow and fury as she demanded justice for her daughter. In private moments she replayed memories of Paris's kindness, her laughter, her dreams, and each one sharpened her resolve. To Grace, Thomas Forrester represented everything she hated about privilege and power, a man whose family influence might protect him from consequences. She vowed that wouldn't happen. As the days passed, cracks formed within the Forrester family itself. Ridge and Brooke argued late into the night, their opposing fears colliding in painful honesty. Brooke confessed that part of her was scared Thomas might be capable of this, that his history made it impossible to ignore the possibility. Ridge exploded, accusing her of abandoning his son when he needed support the most. "You're supposed to be on our side," he shouted. Brooke shot back, tears streaming down her face. "I'm on the side of the truth," she cried. "And I don't know what that is anymore." Steffi, caught in the middle, withdrew from everyone, focusing solely on her children as if protecting them from the chaos might somehow undo it all. Yet even in her isolation, the doubts crept in. Late one night, she remembered a voicemail Thomas had left her weeks before. His voice agitated, talking about Paris pulling away, about feeling like he was losing control again. The memory haunted her, and for the first time, Steffi wondered if there was something her brother wasn't telling anyone. Maybe even himself. The preliminary hearing arrived with crushing inevitability. Cameras lined the courthouse steps as Thomas was brought in, his wrists cuffed, his eyes searching the crowd for familiar faces. When he locked eyes with Ridge, something passed between them. A mixture of hope, fear, and unconditional love that no verdict could erase. Inside the courtroom, the prosecutor laid out the case with chilling precision, emphasizing Thomas's volatile past, his argument with Paris, the physical evidence placing him at the scene. Each word felt like a hammer striking Ridge's heart. The defense countered with the lack of direct evidence, the possibility of an accident, the unanswered questions surrounding Paris's death. When the judge ruled there was enough evidence to proceed to trial, a collective gasp filled the room. Ridge closed his eyes, his worst fear now undeniable. This nightmare wasn't ending anytime soon. As Thomas was led away, he turned back one last time, his voice ringing out in the hushed courtroom. "I didn't kill her," he said, not just to the judge, but to everyone who had ever believed in him. Outside, the media frenzy erupted, headlines screaming speculation and judgment, while inside the Forrester family fractured further under the strain. Yet beneath the chaos, a single truth remained painfully clear. Paris Buckingham was gone, and no matter what the trial revealed, nothing would ever bring her back. The only question left was whether the truth would destroy another life in the process, or finally set it free. The days after the preliminary hearing settled into a grim routine that none of them recognized as life anymore. Time moved differently now, measured not in meetings or milestones but in court dates, visiting hours, and breaking news alerts that made everyone's heart stop before they even read the headline. Thomas was transferred to county jail, a colder, harsher place that stripped away whatever illusion he still had that this was all some terrible misunderstanding that would be cleared up quickly. The clang of metal doors, the echoing footsteps of guards, the constant hum of tension in the air, it all pressed down on him, forcing him to confront the reality that his freedom, his reputation, and maybe even his future were slipping through his fingers. At night, lying on a narrow bunk under flickering fluorescent lights, he replayed the last weeks of his life over and over, searching desperately for the moment where everything went wrong. He remembered Paris standing by her window, arms crossed, her voice shaking as she told him she couldn't keep doing this. The uncertainty, the emotional chaos that always seemed to follow him. He remembered feeling rejected, exposed, terrified of being alone again, and hating himself for feeling that way. What he didn't remember was violence, and that absence gnawed at him more cruelly than any accusation ever could. Ridge visited as often as he was allowed, trying to be strong for his son even as the ground beneath him continued to crumble. Sitting across from Thomas in the sterile visiting room, separated by thick glass and a telephone receiver that felt insultingly impersonal, Ridge made the same promise every time. "I'm not giving up on you," he said, his voice firm even when his eyes betrayed exhaustion. "No matter what anyone says." Thomas nodded, grateful but hollow, because he could see the doubt Ridge was fighting to suppress. A father always knows his child, but Ridge also knew Thomas's darkness, had watched him battle it for years. Loving him didn't mean ignoring reality, and that contradiction was slowly tearing Ridge apart. After one visit, Ridge lingered in his car in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel as a sob ripped out of him, raw and uncontrolled. For the first time, he allowed himself to ask the question he'd been avoiding since the arrest. Not out loud, not even fully formed, but enough to hurt. What if my son doesn't remember what he did? Brooke felt herself drifting further away from Ridge, not because she didn't care, but because caring hurt too much. She threw herself into work, into charity events for victims' families, into anything that kept her from sitting still long enough for her thoughts to catch up with her. But guilt followed her everywhere. She remembered the time she'd warned people about Thomas, the time she'd insisted he was dangerous, and now that those fears seemed to be coming true, she hated herself for feeling even a trace of vindication. At the same time, she couldn't ignore the ache she felt for Paris, for a young woman whose life had ended violently and senselessly. Brooke found herself lighting a candle at night, whispering apologies into the quiet, to Paris, to Thomas, to Ridge, knowing none of them could hear her, and wondering if forgiveness was even possible in a situation like this. Steffi's world narrowed to the size of her children and her immediate family, yet even that small circle felt fragile. Finn watched her carefully, worried by the way she flinched at every siren, every knock at the door. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Steffi finally broke down and told Finn about the voicemail Thomas had left her weeks before. As she played it for him, hearing her brother's strained voice again sent a chill through her. Finn listened quietly, his doctor's instincts kicking in, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "This doesn't make him a killer," he said gently when it ended. "It makes him someone who was struggling." Steffi nodded, but the distinction offered little comfort. Struggling had led Thomas down dangerous paths before, and she couldn't shake the fear that this time, the consequences were irreversible. Hope tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy at Forrester Creations, but Thomas's absence was a constant, haunting presence. Every design meeting felt incomplete, every sketchboard a reminder of what they'd lost. Not just Paris, but the future they'd all assumed was guaranteed. When Hope caught employees whispering or staring at her with pity, anger flared inside her. She wanted to scream that Thomas was more than his worst mistakes, that he deserved a fair chance, but she also knew the optics were terrible. Late one evening, she found herself alone in the design office, staring at a gown Paris had helped conceptualize months earlier. Running her fingers over the fabric, Hope felt tears well up as grief finally broke through her carefully constructed composure. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into the empty room, not sure who she was apologizing to anymore.